Hello and welcome to the latest episode of All In, the Sustainable Business Podcast. I'm David Grayson and I'm joined today by both my co-hosts. Mark in California, you're fully recuperated and refreshed from a Thanksgiving extended holiday?
Yeah, a bit of a family break that extended over Thanksgiving and then all of the feasting and very little of the shopping that are associated with the holiday.
You look robust, Mark. You ate a lot of turkey. It's good.
There was a lot of food.
Healthy.
All
And
kinds of it.
Chris, you're sounding very sprightly. The surgery is all
My
behind you.
ankle surgery is behind me. I'm in a cast, but yeah, feeling pretty good. The painkillers are not as plentiful as they were a couple of days ago, so hopefully I'll be coherent. And we're experiencing 30 centimeters of snow the last couple of days here in Waterloo, Ontario. So
Wow.
feeling Christmassy.
So I'm not going to talk about the fact it's a little bit chilly here in central London, because by contrast, it would sound rather pathetic. Okay, so our topic today is a bit different because we want to explore the contribution of His Majesty King Charles III, known to many of us as the Prince of Wales, because of course he was the longest serving Prince of Wales. We're all three as co-hosts. We're all in different ways subjects of His Majesty, because Chris and Mark, of course, have the King of Canada. And we decided that this would be a really interesting topic. How has now the King contributed over 50 years to debates around sustainability and corporate responsibility and responsible business and sustainable finance? And I can't think of three people I would rather have to try and debate and discuss this topic than our three guests today. We've got not one, but two dames. We've got Dame Polly Courtice, the founder and long-term director of the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. Whenever I travel anywhere in the world and doing a sustainability conference, I will be chatting to people afterwards and said, "Oh, I did a CISL program." And the alumni network that has been created from Cambridge is just phenomenal in terms of developing successive leaders. And then we've got Dame Julia Cleverdon. Julia, of course, long-term CEO of Business in the Community, the King's Responsible Business Network, then subsequently special advisor, helping to rationalize many of his charities as they started to think about the inevitable succession. And Tony Juniper, who is now Tony Juniper, who is now the chair of Natural England, but has written books with His Majesty, has been a special advisor with him on environmental questions. So three incredibly good people to have a debate around this contribution. And maybe I could just get you each to reflect first off on your kind of origin story with him. How did you get involved? And maybe if I could start with Polly.
Yes, well, it goes back a very long way. I first really encountered His Majesty and indeed his team back in 1992, not long after the Rio summit, where I think His Majesty's team contacted me to ask if we would be willing to run a program for business leaders to help them understand these challenges that have really become crystallized globally at the summit. And he very much wanted us to help those business leaders have access to the very best thinking and practice, and to develop an understanding of what was really going on in the system that should not just challenge and worry us, but also galvanize action. He wanted us to help create a core of champions in the business community to drive change in response to these issues, recognizing that the business community had been very much behind the curve, as it was. So we set up what has now become then became the Prince of Wales's Business and Sustainability Program, and led on to multiple other things within the Institute. But that 1992, we ran the first program in 1994, and never looked
I
back.
think the original plan was it was just going to be a one-off, but straight away in the midst of that
Well,
inaugural
I think that's very
program, you realised.
Yeah, very typical of His Majesty. It was billed to me as a one-off summer school, And suddenly when we ran that summer school, there was never any question that it would carry on. So we just did.
It still does,
And,
Polly.
What's that, Tony?
It still does run, of
It
course.
still does. I think you were on it. I mean, Tony is a wonderful contributor to this program. It runs all over the world. It has, as you've rightly pointed out, David, it has spawned a network of 20,000-30,000 alumni from that program and associates and the programs that span out from it. So it's been an enormously, it was a pivotal moment though, that would you do a one-off summer school? And it is very, very typical of him that it went from strength to strength and never stopped.
And Julia, I think your first contact goes back even earlier to the 1980s.
Well, I was at the Industrial Society running a campaign in the late 70s about how do you get people to understand the importance of industry and commerce creating the stuff. And I invited the then Prince of Wales, who'd just come off his naval ship, I think, to come and talk at, or to be part of a conference called Industry Matters OK, with 500 students in that mad building, the engineers building just by the Thames. And in order to get some publicity, I knew the Prince of Wales would certainly get us some publicity, but I thought it would be helpful if 500 students, wrote on the balloons, the helium balloons, industry matters because, and then we give a prize for the balloon that had gone furthest. They were all pumped up with helium stuff. There's, in fact, a funny picture of me and the Prince of Wales, aged whatever he was, about 40, I suppose, just. No, how old was 78? Not very old, at any rate. And all the balloons were let off, and he was rather giggly about the things that young people had written on their balloon, which said industry matters because it's the checkbook of life. Industry matters because Mr. Bloggins says so, and various other things. So we were roaring with laughter. All the balloons went off, and then the Gold Command police officer arrived and said, got permission to let off 500 helium balloons in the path of the Thames River, which is the helicopter's main fly past. I said, I never knew you had to have permission. Extraordinary. Prince of Wales roared with laughter and said, oh, Julia, I can see you're a hell of a disruptor. We shall have fun. And that was the first time I remember talking to him. And then fast forward 1988, I'd gone to work with David at Business in the Community. David was the ops director and I was the development director. We'd actually been much better the other way around. But anyway, we worked very happily together. And then I took on as chief executive in 91. And around that time, we'd begun to suggest to him, who was a very active Business in the Community president, all over the place on all the things that businesses needed to do. What could they do about their workplace, their marketplace, their community? And he was increasingly concerned about what they were doing on the environment. So we made a funny film called Grime Goes Green with video arts, all about the visit of a royal visitor going around a paint factory. And everybody's trying to clean up for the royal visitor and never stop pouring the paint down the drain and, doing all sorts of extremely non-environmentally sensible things, even in those days. I think we just about understood. And there was a good deal of fuss at Buckingham Palace as to why he was doing this. And there was great thrill from John Cleese that he did do it, because John Cleese was very funny. And they had Video Arts, who ran it, had an enormous management training market. So just in the same way as he, about that time, got to Polly and said, how do you get to the most senior business leaders? He was already thinking, so how do you get to the factory managers? How do you get to the site managers, the people actually who'd be being trained by Video Arts on effective use of time or better management of meetings or whatever it was? And so he saw absolutely early on the importance of getting Grime Goes Green into the Video Arts catalogue. And that was the first big thing I worked with him on the environment.
And we should explain that Grime was played by John Cleese as the rather hapless factory manager. Absolutely, yes. Tony, what about you? When did you first work with him?
Well, during my early days working at Friends of the Earth, David, when I went there to lead the Tropical Rainforest campaign in 1990, His Royal Highness, as was Prince of Wales, was helping us with a conference looking at the economic value of forests beyond them being converted into cattle pasture or cut down for timber, and inviting the world to be thinking about the non-market values in terms of the forest products that we could get, that we could harvest without destroying the forest. And so opening people's eyes to the huge value of these systems. And that was a great moment for me as a young campaigner working at Friends of the Earth. But I must say, he'd inspired me as a young environmentalist long before then. And I do remember growing up during the 1970s and beginning to develop an interest in ecological issues and listening to some of his speeches and just being really struck by this incredibly powerful message coming from somebody who was at the heart of the establishment. And I can't overstate the importance of that, actually, because in those days, unlike now, environmental questions did feel quite fringe. It did feel as though they weren't part of the mainstream. And yet here was someone who was really bringing it to public attention in a way that couldn't be ignored. And he'd had really quite a profound impact on my thinking by that time, when I was beginning to work to influence policy and to change the minds of company executives about the importance of ecological themes. And then the contact I had with him over many years, whilst I worked at Friends of the Earth, was in relation to climate change, in relation to agricultural policy, a lot of exchange around the late 1990s around the theme of genetically modified crops and foods. And yes, really quite an inspiration for me as someone who was developing concerns really in the wake of what he was putting out into the public domain, well ahead of what most other commentators were saying. And of course, he was also inspiring in those days and remains so today, not least because of his commitment and determination to the issues. This wasn't someone who was bringing a cursory interest to these subjects. He was suffering from really quite aggressive personal attacks. He was being ridiculed, and yet he stuck to his guns and he continued to bring his pro-ecological message to the world in ways that, as I say, really inspired me, and feels a great privilege looking back over the many years of doing a little bit of work with him here and there to have had that that interaction.
And Tony, the many years comment and the timeline all three of you are speaking to, sort of late 80s, early 90s, but you also going back to his speeches of the 1970s. So he was bringing this very early and demonstrating his interest and knowledge. How ready was the audience when you all tried to work with him and bring this to the business community? What was the initial response?
Well, in the early days, he was ridiculed and seen as an outlier, but he stuck to his guns and he repeated his message in lots of different ways through lots of different routes. And over time, the world has caught up with him, including the business community. And Julia, in particular, will have recollections from those early days of convening groups of companies who hadn't really heard about these subjects and certainly hadn't seen it as something that they really needed to pay attention to. So he really was a pioneer and someone who was trailblazing, including in this interaction with the private sector, which these days, most big organizations in the corporate world and in the financial sector, they have some level of understanding about sustainability and what they need to do about it. But he was bringing this message at a time where they really had no idea that they had to do anything about it. But Julia was there and Polly in a separate route on that business side. I was more there in the environmental science and in the campaigning space, and saw some of his work with the business community later on. But in terms of those early days, I think Julia and Polly probably have got a better insight.
But he's always been absolutely brilliant at picking the right organization for the strength that they would bring to that particular thing. So business community which he'd been part of since the middle 80s, when Stephen O'Brien, who was the first chief executive there, saw that you could get him to be passionate about enterprise, how do we create more jobs, which was the issue for the 80s. And he got him into business in the community. And I think in a way, today's language would be, it was quite a safe space for him, because there were quite a lot of great business leaders around that who didn't know anything at all really about environment, but could see that his passion and interest was such. And he began to pick off particular business leaders who'd run him a particular burst of speed on one thing. So I always remember him getting Derek Higgs, who was the most lovely, tremendous character out of the city, really. And he said, I just want to know how many investors think this stuff is important. How do businesses behave? Would investors take any notice of it? And we did a big bit of research in the early 90s, I think, and out came the results that 1% of investors would take any notice of it at all. And I remember him going to see the Prince of Wales, Derek Higgs, with the report. Prince lovely to him and said, oh, I'm so grateful to you for doing it. We've got an awful lot of way to go. What are we going to call this report? And Derek said, I'm going to call it Dripping on a Stone. And we went on doing the flaming report for another 20 years or so. So he used us for that. But at the same moment, he could see that Polly and Cambridge and that high, attractive brand and knowledge and international reach would be the place to put down his leadership program. And then he said to somebody else, why don't we get accounting for sustainability going? Let's get the finance directors around it. And both Polly and I said, oh my God, another one. They've now got to join us for this. They've got to join Polly for that. Now we've got to have the accounting for sustainability. But he was right. Finance directors didn't want to go to something that business community were running, because that was where the chief execs were. So he was very good at picking the right horse for the right race. And he was incredible at his international grip on this from a very early moment. I spent much of the 90s fiddling about trying to get something, what the hell was it called? In-kind direct, which he'd seen in Canada. And he really was clear that we could be doing so much better on recycling, tubes of toothpaste that hadn't got a purple stripe in because nobody'd pressed the right button. Why could we not get this toothpaste into the homeless hostels? So he was, he is an absolutely extraordinary finder of the clever, creative way of getting more things to happen. But Polly perhaps, she drove a great drive with him.
And Polly?
I think what he was so brilliant at was understanding how to use his exceptional convening power to bring the right people together at the right time around the right issues, with, of course, the help from organizations like Business in the Community, Cambridge Institute, Accounting for Sustainability. But he really understood that and sort of in a way, he alone could get those very most senior influential decision makers around the table, often around the dinner table, to talk openly and honestly about what the challenges were that they were facing. And I think that's another thing that I was struck by with him. Has a great ability to understand where people are, to start with where they are, what's constraining them. He recognized very, very early on that the business community wasn't just doing what it was doing because it didn't give a damn. Tony and Julia said earlier, many of them were shockingly ignorant about what was happening in the system. And he managed to make it possible, certainly through our program and I think through Business in the Community, to help people to grapple with this phenomenal system pressures that were going on and work out how to respond to them in terms that they could put into practice in reality. He wasn't asking them to do something which, if they really put their minds to it, they couldn't do. And I think that meant people very much more willing to stay with him, to join and continue to belong, and to try and work together. And through his convening power, we set up things like the corporate leaders group, a group for the insurance sector, bringing all the top 10 leaders of the insurance sector together, top 10 banks, top 10 financial institutions. And of course, he subsequently brought together the Sustainable Markets Initiative. He understands the mechanisms by which those very influential people can be agents for change. And he creates that safe space for them at the early stages to get them to commit. And once they've committed, our job was to never let them go, which of course we were very good at doing.
The only example I can think of that did let go was the Prince of Wales International Business Leaders Forum. But of course, he started, and Robert Davies ran so well, and that was at Globescan, that was our connection, where the forum was a partner in the 1999 global poll that we did called the Millennial Poll on Corporate Social Responsibility. And I think, and David, you've turned us onto this before too, just the degree to which His Majesty, and when he was the prince, was consistent and committed, and the level of showing up, like the sweat equity that he would put in this is I think what many people didn't understand, or I didn't understand at the time either. But I wonder, where does the passion come from His Majesty's persistence and commitment? Does anyone know the origin story of that?
So I think I had a few little insights into this during the course of being a co-author with him in his book Harmony, that was published back in 2010, which is his philosophy, really, that unites all of his different interests, from tropical forests to sustainable agriculture to architecture to sustainable economics, and pulling all of that together into a single treatise in terms of how all of his different views and interests and passions fit together. And during the course of that, it became apparent that his commitment to these questions, it goes back very far into his childhood. And he does speak in that book about the sense of unease he had as a teenager, witnessing the transformation both of the rural landscapes in England and across the UK more broadly, and also the cityscapes at a time when the ancient medieval town centres were being torn down and converted into brutalist architecture with tower blocks, the countryside being transformed from a patchwork quilt of woodlands and hedgerows and small ponds, being turned into industrial agriculture soaked in pesticides. And it was this that gave him a sense of unease at a very deep personal level, which I think is really what then propelled him into an interest in finding out more, understanding the science, beginning to piece together different parts of the jigsaw to understand not only what the problem was, but what the solutions could look like. And so I think this comes from a very deep personal place, as it does for many people who work in this field over a very long period of time. It's not something that you're asked to do or told to do. It comes from inside. And I think very much that is his journey, is coming from that place of personal unease, and then wishing to do something about it, and using that unbelievably unique position that he was in as Prince of Wales to use that place of influence to advance this cause. And he's been with it ever since. And one other thing that's just worth mentioning, because he has always been driven by the science, by facts, by information, and he's paid close attention to that. One thing I've always been struck by is this deep empathy, however, that he has for the people who are part of these ecological stories. And so, for example, the indigenous people of the rainforests, and his deep care for them, the farmers who are suffering from the consequences of industrial farming. It's not just the birds and the butterflies. Rural economies have been changed inexorably by this shift to monoculture and industrial agriculture. And then the fishing communities who have suffered the consequences of overexploitation of fish stocks. And then the many, many visits he's made to comfort communities hit by hurricanes and floods and storms. It's always a very people-centric story that he's trying to tell, and not something which is about applying the science to some abstract ecological ideas. And I've always been very struck by that. And again, it speaks very much to him as a person, as well as to, the facts of these big challenges that are in front of us.
Perhaps without using the words, kind of a oh, I was going to say perhaps without using the words, an early advocate for just transition. But Polly, please.
No, I was just going to say that although his focus was so deeply personal, he has an extraordinary ability also, as Tony said earlier, to grapple with the science. I mean, he really, without being able to go deeply into the science, he has a grasp of the scientific principles which are driving so many of these issues in a way that is quite remarkable. And he's able to retrieve that information in a discussion and a conversation and to point out some quite hard facts. One of the greatest sadnesses, I think, for him was how many times people described him as being anti-science. Absolutely, it was never
true.
so
Yeah.
completely. So it was quite shocking, and I know that cut him very deeply. And it was not just the business community, not even the business community that was leveling that charge against him. I'm sorry to say, some of the academics were amongst the most vociferous critics of his approach to science because it didn't suit them.
I so agree with you, Tony. What is so interesting for me as you describe that incredible sort of tour de horizon, he's an extraordinarily holistic thinker. I remember once having been made to go and speak at Cranfield, where the Princess Royal, his sister, was chairing the do, and I wasn't quite sure what I was meant to be doing, but I was meant to be sort of giving examples of great things that the Prince of Wales had done in his work with business community. And I chatted away for a bit and tried to land some points. And like only sisters can, she stood up at the end and said, "It's so interesting to hear about my brother, who I obviously know well, in a different context from somebody who also obviously knows him quite well." And I was thinking, people often say, "What's the difference between the two of you?" And I always say, look, you must remember, I am one of the best HGV truck drivers in Britain, one of the best fly fishers. And I thought it was an interesting, if slightly mean, sisterly remark, because it does look from outside as if he's casting his fly onto it. Here's another thing, and here's another thing, and here's another thing, and what are we doing about it? But actually, it comes from a very, very clear holistic philosophy, which I'm sure you're absolutely right, Tony. I think both the relationship with his childhood, the relationship with his father, and what his father believed was important to do, as opposed to what he believed was important to do, I think that was quite a driver. If you think how long it took us to get WWF, probably you're not allowed to put this bit in, but there were many reasons as to why WWF were not going to be the thing he was part of, and it took us some time to work through with a different generation to explain that actually, they were in the end going to do some of the right things.
Mark.
Yeah, I'm thinking about how these lessons translate. Obviously, a remarkable individual who is part of an exceptional, globally recognized institution. And so, what do other leaders, I kind of want to say heads of state, but heads of states are often not monarchs. So, what do other leaders take from the way he has led on sustainability, whether they are public sector, whether they are senior business leaders? How can we translate some of his commitment, some of his knowledge of the topic, some of what seems like his empathy and ability to engage, regardless, whether or not they literally wear the crown?
Yeah. Well, consistency and determination, I think, are two of the hallmarks that lie behind how he's managed to make such a difference over so many years. But the thing, Mark, about that is that he did have that spark. He did have that personal motivation. Maybe the question slightly upstream of yours is how do we generate and inspire that motivation in leaders to the point where they actually wish to make a contribution in the first place? Because that is something that evidently comes from something other than more information and more facts about the state of the world. And possibly the most interesting question of all is, how do we get people interested to the point where they wish to make a difference on this? Because that then determines, all of the rest of their impact and all of the things you said. How do they use empathy? How do they use leadership? How do they generate authenticity? They need to want to do it to begin with. And I think that's where we all have big questions as being advocates for a more rational ecological future, is how do we get people to want to own the challenge to the point where they do wish to put in the effort and to put that personal contribution behind it, because still quite a lot of people don't. And in the current phase we're in, quite a lot of people now are actively hostile and see this as a matter of personal identity to be against causes like doing something about climate change or, a more ecologically secure future. It's gone into quite a strange place, and how we change that is a really big question. And I'm not sure I know the answer. I don't know if any of our fellow panelists might know what we could do to achieve that.
His position is unique, and so it's difficult to draw direct parallels between how he can achieve what he achieves and what others. But I think you're absolutely right, Tony, that a determination, that persistence, that adherence to this agenda for a very, very long time. But I would also add, and it relates to this point about what's happening in the sustainability movement now, his visceral determination to make things different, bordering on rage sometimes, that it's so hard to move the dial. So that feeling that somehow we're not moving fast enough, nothing is good enough. I mean, sometimes all three of us, I don't doubt, will have felt that time where you go back to him, you say, "I've done what you asked me to, sir," and he'll say, "Yes, and," and then there's another whole stream of things which he would have expected and continues to expect, and it's incremental building on achievement that I think he is a good example for leaders, but perhaps doing it in a slightly different way, but seeing this as just a stage, a phase of a journey rather than just a destination having been reached, which of course we are so far from having done.
Yeah.
But I think there were moments when, I absolutely agreed on the dogged, the persistence, the memory like an elephant, and, blah, blah, blah. But I would also say that there did come a moment when he realized that actually, if you took it at the flood and just attacked them, you would get nowhere. And there was a extraordinary gathering of that slightly over-ambitious idea called START, which was when I saw him decide that actually we couldn't just say, you've got to do it right to the end of this. And he began to say, you've just got to start. We've just got to get going on this. That's how we will find some early wins, begin to get more people to see the point. And I think he has changed tactics as he's gone through. Behind closed doors, he's been absolutely as dogged and furious and, what did that man ever do? He came to dinner and I never saw a thing of him again, But actually, in general, and Tony would know much more about this because he does so much of the speech writing with him, he is more prepared to believe that this is a very, very long run to hoe and that you've got a lot of things to do to move different generations at different speeds with different reasons and different arguments. I think he's become in the environments, he may still be raging, but I think he's got more balance on how fast you can move anything while personally being desperate as all of us would
I
be.
agree, Julia. I then it is that kind of inner rage shines out nearly so often now, and as he could see things, organizations around him picking up parts of the agenda, I think it helped to ease that sense of frustration that he felt that he was the only person out there who could see what was really going on. In a way, he built around him a community of people like us who helped him to implement or to get into sort of practical reality some of the things that he had developed over the years from his youngest days.
So we've talked about a number of things that has made his distinctive contribution so important over the decades. The absolute dogged determination, the convening power, the ability to be able to assemble a team of individuals and different organizations that would be horses for courses in terms of where to allocate certain different tasks to. We've talked about the fact that he does understand the science, but he's also got that human empathy. One of the other things I would personally add, based on experience, is his ability to be able to spot the unexpected and often rather unusual connections, but which, when you think about it, is so blooming obvious and is really so creative. And I, on more than one occasion, found going into a session to brief him on something, having spent weeks or months on it, and he then spots that connection, that synergy that I had not done so. And I went out of the room afterwards kicking myself, because in retrospect, yes, but he has that great gift. And it's also one I think he shares with his sister, Princess Anna, as well. But any other things that you've seen over the years that has helped him to be effective?
I think one thing, David, and it links to the convening power and this idea of bringing people together, is his ability to create connections across disparate sectors of society. And we're talking today mostly about business, but one experience I had with him was the setting up and then the development of the so-called Prince's Rainforests project, which was initiated in 2008. And this was an attempt, and this is his words, an attempt to make the forests worth more alive than dead. And so he cut straight to the chase. He'd realized that the deforestation that was and is still going on wasn't a technical problem. It wasn't a problem of science or evidence. It was an economic failing, and the extent to which, it was seen as rational to clear the Amazon and the Central African rainforests for some kind of economic development, when in fact the economic consequences of that would be totally catastrophic for the world. And what he'd realized was that there's no one set of actors can sort this out. It's not just the businesses, it's not just the international agencies. It's actually a very broad group of stakeholders who need to come together. And so the Prince's Rainforests project was an attempt to bring national governments, the private sector, big companies like Cargill and Unilever, global agencies like the World Bank and Food and Agriculture Organization, big scientific bodies, and the major NGOs like Friends of the Earth and Greenpeace into a common conversation alongside the finance sector to begin thinking through what can be done to correct this economic failure, whereby the forests are seen as worth more dead than alive. And that was a really eye-opening experience for me. And as Polly says, very thoughtful reflections, and as Julia said, about who can bring what and what's the particular perspective of these different groups to be able to move us towards a better conclusion. And actually that work, it got enmeshed with the global climate negotiations. And I think it's fair to say led to a material positive difference being created in Paris in 2015, when the Paris Agreement through the climate negotiations was finally agreed. And I don't think it's any accident that the Prince of Wales, as was now King Charles, was invited to make the opening speech there at the high-level segment at the beginning of that summit, because he had put in so many years of effort in bringing all of these different actors together to try and find a way of making the forests worth more alive than dead, with some of that learning and that wisdom and that negotiation being reflected in the Paris Accord in terms of how carbon and deforestation would be linked together. Of course, still work in progress, but that was a significant step forward. And I think it was, in some large part, his prescience in being able to see that there was no solution unless we got everybody lined up behind this really complicated, wicked problem, which he did make a very material difference in doing, because that convening power was harnessed to get all those people together in rooms over multiple occasions over a period of years. Still work in progress. But
And when did that take place, Tony, to put it in context of 2015?
well, the Paris Accord obviously was negotiated in Paris, but the convenings that took place through the Prince's Rainforest project much of it was in London, but not only, all over the world. Literally, he was conducting meetings when he was traveling on different bits of state business as he was going through his normal work schedule. He was tagging on meetings pretty much everywhere in the world, actually, and doing field visits, one in Sumatra during that period where he was able to talk about the forests when he was there. And yes, so a multi-layered initiative, which had him very much front and center, but with a team working behind the scenes to do a lot of the work that, enabled those meetings, and then took the outputs of those meetings to take momentum to the next stage. And a fantastic group of people working on all of that in that project over those years.
I think what's so
Amazing.
skillful is how he manages to navigate around what might be seen by some as very political terrain,
Exactly.
and not being the front and center person in the debate, but actually by convening people to be the actors that are challenging the political system and the economic system, and he does that absolutely brilliantly. I mean, my first realization just how skillful that can be is way back in 2005 when um, I'm sorry to say, but the CBI and Digby Jones and co were arguing that dealing with climate change was anti-business and anti-competitive.
Mm.
And Tony Blair was about to host a G8 summit up in Glasgow, I think, and he very explicitly said at a public lecture, the corporate sector is holding me back. I can't actually go there and argue on climate change if the leaders of the business community are arguing against it. And the prince then agreed with me that he would convene a group of business leaders who would argue exactly the opposite. That was actually the origins of the corporate leaders group, the UK corporate leaders group, which argued that what they really wanted was for government to go further, faster, give them clarity, give them certainty, and absolutely commit to addressing climate change through policy and regulation. In fact, that led to the UK's first Climate Change Act, which was passed in 2008. And although he would never have put himself in the frame as having been that politically involved, the fact that he brought that group of very senior business leaders together to argue for positive action was hugely influential in getting us to be right at the forefront of the climate change debate way back in 2008. And there are multiple other examples like that, where the groups that he has convened have been more influential in the political sphere than he could ever be as an individual.
And that's a really important point, isn't it? Because what he has been able to do over the last half century or so is within the constraints of the fact that the monarch or the heir to the throne must be absolutely above party politics, and there must be no suggestion that they're becoming party politically identified. I wonder, Julia or Tony, any further thoughts building on what Polly just said about the way that he navigated around, used the guardrails of not being party political, that might also give some clues perhaps for others, business leaders trying to navigate some of the treacherous political cross currents that we see in certain parts of the world today?
Well, I was laughing when Polly was talking because in 2008, absolutely right, he was driving on that and it had come out of the CBI attitudes and so forth. But at exactly the same moment, he was saying to business community, would you please run the May Day summits? Do you remember May Day, the earth is calling? And at 6 weeks' notice, we had to get 1,000 business leaders across the country to connect in on, nobody even knew what Zoom was, I think, in those days, with Jonathan Porridge and God knows what, and all the operation. Now, all of that was going on with an organization that he knew could probably pull out medium-sized businesses across Britain, which would get more energy and noise at regional, local level. At the same moment as he was driving the big activity with Polly, and every now and then Polly and I would, I'm sure, ring each other up and say, well, we're doing this. What are you? Oh, goodness, right. Well, how many people have asked Unilever for exactly the same amount of money? Well, probably all of us. And that was where we did begin to slightly try to get a few more traffic lights running about, okay, who's in the lead on this? Good-temperedly, generally, but he is an absolute masterclass. Never believe that you're only ever doing one thing. You're doing at least 6, probably sometimes without many bits of your office entirely understanding that that is what's going on.
And Tony?
There is a very clever campaigner.
Yeah. So to that point of political neutrality, he's navigated this very well over the decades that he's had such a high profile on these subjects, which sometimes do get into a political space. But I think there's a couple of things that have enabled him to navigate that. One is this reference always to the evidence and the science. He's always placing his views in a fact-based, evidence-based storyline, which enables him to be very grounded and therefore connected to what's actually going on, rather than expressing a disconnected opinion, as it were. And then, the other thing, and this is the conversation we're having today, is recognizing that, his influence can be biggest out with those very political contexts, and therefore working with business is a non-political audience, and so it does enable him to have that kind of conversation, which isn't going to get tied up with some of these party political themes. And then the other piece, which grew over the years, is just his authenticity. I mean, he's coming from a place which is totally trustworthy, in the sense of he doesn't have an axe to grind. He's coming from a place of genuine concern about the future of society, and therefore the questioning of his motives, it becomes quite difficult to say that he's political, because he obviously isn't. And that obviously isn't conclusion comes from many decades of contribution. And I think a combination of those things, of choosing his points of contact, his evidence base, and the fact that he's got a track record in it and is authentic, I think has enabled him to navigate these hazardous waters of politics, which are difficult for him in the positions that he's occupied as Prince of Wales and now as King Charles.
Well, that's, of course, a very powerful reminder that he didn't need to do any of this.
Exactly.
It wasn't in the job description back in the 1970s. Now, imagine, I don't know whether he has ever listened to the podcast. It would be wonderful if he did, but imagine that he was listening to this episode of All in the Sustainable Business Podcast. What one message would you each like to give to him in terms of what you think that he's been able to achieve? Because I suspect we've probably all been in meetings with him over the decades where he has sometimes questioned, am I making a difference?
Yes.
And so on. So what would be your kind of parting message from this episode to him? Who's going to start? Julia?
I think I'd thank him for his unbelievable generosity of spirit, that actually over the years, practically every time I'd come to a bit of a crossroads on what should we do, how should we do it, what would you suggest? Tony Juniper and I had a marvelous journey in a train down to Anthropy just after I'd taken on chairing the National Lottery Community Fund. And Tony put me absolutely right as to what we should be spending 15% of our £1 billion a year on climate change and environment work, and suggested I should go and talk to the king. And I thought, well, he's got many other things, but I sent him a message saying we'd had a lovely train journey and these were some of the things we were talking about. He said, come to tea at once. You can always tell if you've got £150 million a year to spend. I can tell you, he's very keen to make sure we spend it properly. And so I said, well, what would you say? It's all got to start with community. He said, you do community energy, community water, community food. Right, now let's have tea. And we're just about to start doing community energy, community food, community water. And, the generosity of his engagement on the importance of this stuff is, just been extraordinary over 50 years.
Tony?
So what would I say to him? He's incredibly modest, and he always feels as though he's not done enough. And I think it would be nice just to remind him that the difference he has made has been totally without precedent globally. I think I can't think of another individual who's made the level of impact that he has made in mainstreaming and raising awareness about these subjects to the point where the world now is in a very different place compared to where it would have been. And so, to the extent that he would, I think, wish to consider this as a major part of his life's work, I think I'd say a big thank you and that it's all been worthwhile. And without it, the world would be in a much worse place.
Thank you. And finally, Polly, it looks like we may have
The
may have
internet in Cambridge.
frozen
Yeah, frozen connection
that-
there, I think, David.
in Cambridge, very 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 sadly, and doesn't look as if it's coming back. But I think that sense of heartfelt appreciation of the enormity of the breadth and depth of the contribution that he has made over 5 decades already, and hopefully for a considerable time to come. It has been a super privilege to have this conversation with 3 people who know so much about the way in which His Royal Highness and now His Majesty have contributed. Polly, you're back. You've
I
got a
am.
chance just for the very final word.
Right. Well, like Tony and Julia, I would like to thank him for the enormous difference he has made in the world and to encourage him to recognize that because he is indeed a very modest individual. I'd also really like to thank him for completely transforming my own organization, Cambridge Institute of Sustainability Leadership, by becoming its patron. It is today what it is, predominantly through his extraordinary contribution. And finally, I'd like to thank him for being really genuinely kind and caring and warm to me as an individual. I've really enjoyed my time with him and felt that he was just so wise and so thoughtful but above all kind. I really appreciated that. It's all 3 of us have had quite challenging times getting this whole system moving, but he was always there to understand what we were trying to do and to appreciate it and to acknowledge it. So massive thanks to him for all those things.
And can I just acknowledge the 3 of you, and you too, David? I mean, all of your collective contributions and work is extraordinary. And I think in sustainability today, we don't sometimes respect the history and from whence we've come and how hard it has been and how deep in the trenches many of us and you have been. And I think in many ways, what transpired in the UK was so fundamental in launching sustainability globally and sustainable business in particular. Something magic happened. Of course, His Majesty from this conversation is at the core of that. So it's really a wonderful story, and thank you all for your service.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
That's all for now.
And thank you for organizing.
Lovely.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Lovely to see you all.
Look after yourself.
Nice chat.
See you soon.
Everyone.